Quilt as you go with sashing, let's do it. Welcome to Island Home. This is our online Quilt as you go masterclass. I'm Monica Poole, I'll be your tutor, and my daughter Laura is behind the camera. Welcome back to Pattern Poole TV. I'm Monica Poole, and this year we have a new online mystery quilt course for you. So normally we run our quilt courses in private Facebook groups, but this year we've decided to make the videos free for everybody to watch because there's always something to learn. Now if you'd like to join in, there's course notes and they're available at the end of every episode, and they're only 10 Australian dollars. It's a mystery quilt, so basically what it's going to be is it's made up of 60% patchwork blocks, 40% applique. All of the techniques are really easy. The patchwork blocks are all different sizes, the applique blocks are all different sizes, but what we're going to really focus on is quilt as you go. So we're going to make this quilt using 6 different quilt as you go techniques, and I'm going to explain lots about quilt as you go, how I make my quilt as you go quilts, and so it's basically a quilt as you go sampler. So this is Island Home episode 1. If you'd like to join in, all you have to do is head to our website, click on Island Home Journal, and you will find a requirements list and a video there of me explaining the requirements list. So we're using fabric by Aboriginal artist Alex Birdfox. He's designed the fabrics for us, and we're just using a solid cream background. There's going to be lots of background. It's going to be just a really nice, fun, beautiful quilt, lots of different techniques to learn, and so I really hope that you'd like to join in. If not, just enjoy the videos and see the quilt come together. So let's get started. In today's episode, we're going to be making 4 pinwheel blocks. We're going to quilt them, and then we're going to join them together using a quilt as you go with sashing method. If you'd like to know more about Island Home, the fabrics and behind the scenes, check out our Island Home Journal on our website. We will be adding entries as we make this quilt. To get started, choose 4 patterned fabrics and cut 2 squares from each fabric. That's going to give you a total of 8 squares in your patterned fabrics. Then we're going to cut another 8 squares from your background fabric that are the same size. So the next step is to mark a diagonal line onto the wrong side of your background squares. Now if you're using a solid fabric, sometimes it can be really difficult to tell the right and wrong side. So just run your fingers over the fabric, and you're just looking for the side that feels smoother. So the wrong side will be a little bit coarser. But if you can't find the right and wrong side, just pick a side and go with it. And that's pretty much what I'm gonna do. Now make sure that your diagonal line is nice and accurate. Now place the background squares right sides together with the pattern squares.
I get it. So you drew the line on the wrong side.
That's right. So I could easily place it right sides together with the patterned fabric. So at the machine, thread up with a neutral coloured thread. I'm just using a bone coloured thread, and I'm using a size 70 or 75 needle. So that is a finer needle. It's not the finest needle, but it is one of the finer needles, because when we are piecing together our patchwork squares, we are basically just sewing through 2 layers of fabric. So that's all you need for piecing. And I also have my 1/4 inch foot, so you can either use one with a guide or one without a guide. So if you're new to quilting, a 1/4 inch foot basically just gives you a distance from the needle to the edge of the foot, which is a 1/4 inch, and in pretty much most patchwork blocks it's always a 1/4 inch seam allowance that you need. So those feet don't normally come with your machine. They are extra ones that you would purchase if you did want to do patchwork and quilting. And I also have a stitch length on, and my stitch length is only 2. So when we're piecing, we use a smaller stitch length because we don't do any reverse stitching. We just sew straight onto our next piece, and the smaller stitch length is going to prevent it from unraveling or your stitching from coming undone. Now, set your machine up so that you're ready to sew and have your pieces next to you, and just so you can sew easily in a production line. And that's what we do with patchwork and quilting, because a lot of times we are sewing lots of pieces together. So when you're set up, you can sew, oh, I was going to say seamlessly, but we need seams, don't we? So smoothly. So now I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch either side of the marked line, and just to get started I'm going to use a scrap of fabric, and this is what's called a leader, and it's going to stop the starting where I start to sew getting chewed down into the hole of the sewing machine. So I've stitched along my leader, and now I'm going to go straight on to sewing either side of the marked line, and this guide is going to go straight onto the marked line, and that is going to give me my 1/4 inch spacing. If you were using the foot without a guide, you would basically just be resting the edge of the foot, which is this part here, on the marked line. So let's start sewing. And we're not going to cut that, we are going to keep chaining on to the next piece. Chaining is when you sew a few stitches on nothing, and then you sew onto your fabric. Just like that. So anyway, one time I was wondering why with the new sewing machines, when you go to sew, does the start of it get chewed down into the hole of the sewing machine? Because when I was growing up and sewing on my mum's old Singer sewing machine, that never happened. And then I realised it's because those machines only did straight sewing. So you had your needle that just went down into a tiny hole on the machine plate, whereas now our machines can do zigzag, and so the needle needs to go from side to side. It needs a bigger space. So rather than just having the one little hole, it now has an oval shape, and there's more space for the fabric to get chewed down into it. So you can actually get a straight stitch plate, which is just a plate that has the one hole in it. That's really good for piecing. You're not going to have that chewing problem, but you do have to remember to change that stitch plate when you want to do other stitches where it's going to move side to side, like zigzag and any of your decorative stitches. So you may notice every time I stop sewing, my needle finishes in the down position and my foot lifts slightly. So this is really handy when I'm sewing from square to square. And that's because I've actually set a function on my machine to do that. So most computerized sewing machines will do this depending on which model you have. So it's a good idea to have a look in your instruction manual to see if your machine does have that function. So without cutting these pieces apart, I'm going to try spinning it around and sewing from the other end, and that may speed up the process so I don't have to keep taking each piece to sew. Let's see if it works.
Did it work?
It's not too bad. I'm just going to sew a little bit more and then let you know.
What was the verdict?
Wasn't too bad. It was a little bit of a fiddle, so it's up to you whether you want to cut them apart before you sew a 1/4 inch on the other side of the line. All done. Now the next step is to cut each square on the marked diagonal line. That will give you 2 half square triangles. Now head to the iron to press the half square triangles, all of them with the seam going towards the patterned fabric. So a tip to ensure that you're going to have nice flat seams is to press the triangle first with the pattern side facing up. So you're just pressing the seam before you open it out. That's actually called setting the seam. I didn't think that that would do anything, but it really does. So you set the seam first and then you open it out and press so that the seam is going towards the patterned fabric. And you always press with a nice clean iron, and you always press with the right side facing up when you open it out. That way you're going to press any little creases out of that seam. And I was just going to say that any little creases that end up in that seam are going to affect the size of your half square triangle. That's why we want to make sure that we don't have any creases pressed into our seam. So now we're going to cut off the excess corners or puppy dog ears. So to lay them out, just start with one half square triangle and you have the patterned one facing this direction, and then your next one you face in the opposite, kind of the opposite direction. But each time you place a triangle down, just spin it until it actually looks like it should look. So it looks like a pinwheel. There we are, like that. And just so that we could see how it was looking, we just placed our center square and our sashing in between. So we're now going to take those pieces away and we're now going to make 4 separate pinwheel blocks. So if you are joining in and making the quilt with us, you'll see that there are places that you can arrange the fabrics how you want them to be, and that's really going to personalize the quilt to make it something special to you. So this is how you make one pinwheel. We're going to take our top 2, we're going to put them right sides together, and we're going to do the same thing with the bottom 2. And when you pop them right sides together, you'll see that the seams are facing an opposite direction, and that means that they're going to link in, or they also call that nesting. And we're just going to sew that seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now, sometimes during the quilt, we will be talking about a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, but with this block, just use your regular 1/4 inch seam allowance. So that's where you're resting the edge of the foot on the edge of the fabric, and that's going to give you that nice 1/4 inch seam allowance. So using the leader again, and a tip for sewing the bottom 2 together, rather than starting off where we have all of our seams, where it's going to be bulky, just flip it over that way. Make sure that you are sewing the correct side, because we don't want to have to do any unpicking. And then sewing from the non-bulky side means that you're going to have less problem when your machine starts to sew. So once again, to set the seam, press with your patterned fabric on top to set the seam, and then flipping it over to press that seam towards the patterned fabric. Now all you have to do is place them right sides together to sew the center seam, and once again you'll see that the seams are facing in opposite direction and they are linking in or nesting. At this point in time, it's a good idea to pin those center seams so that your pin is going in through the stitching line at the top and making sure that it's lining up with the stitching line at the bottom, bringing it back and back up to the top again. And now sew the center seam. As we approach the pin, slide it out. Use an unpicker or a tailor's awl just to push those seams towards the foot. Happy with that. Now I'm going to head to the iron and press that seam. To press the center seam, press it open because it's going to be really bulky in the center where all of those seams meet at the same point. And that's just going to reduce some of that bulk. So that's how you make one pinwheel, so go ahead and repeat the process to make the other 3. And here are my 4 pinwheel blocks. So now it's time to quilt the pinwheel blocks. If you are consistent with your seam allowance all the way through, they should all be the same size. And we're not going to trim them before we quilt them because every time you quilt something, it shrinks in a little bit. So we'll do the quilting first and then we'll trim. So to quilt each of the blocks, you're going to need a square of backing fabric and a square of batting. So our backing fabric and our batting are a little bit bigger than our pinwheel block for this particular method. So I've just cut my backing and batting the same size. They're 1 inch bigger than the pinwheel blocks. So then when I layer them together, I can just pop the pinwheel in the center. So that's just going to give me about a 1/2 inch space all the way around the edge. We just do that to make sure that you can easily see where your batting and backing is and make sure that it has full coverage underneath our pinwheel block. I'm using warm and natural batting, so on one side it has these natural cotton flecks in it, and as I'm using a cream fabric on the top, I'm going to use the side without the flecks facing up, and that way it's not going to show through my cream background fabric. So I'm just going to use some safety pins to hold the layers together, and I'm just going to pop 1 pin in each of the patterned pieces, and that's going to be enough just to hold this small section together. So back at the machine, I recommend threading up with a thread that matches your background fabric, but I'm going to use the same bone color that I did all of the piecing with because I realize that's going to stand out a little bit more on camera to show the quilting. And I have a size 80 quilting needle, I have my walking foot attached, and to quilt I'm going to use a stitch length of 3. So it's important to use a larger stitch length than normal when you're sewing through a lot of thicknesses. That way you're not going to end up with lots of tiny little stitches. And to start with, we're just going to stitch in the ditch of all of the seams. So just out of interest, all the walking feet for the different brands look a little bit different. So just Google or head to your local sewing machine dealer and they'll be able to help you with which walking foot suits your sewing machine. Before we begin quilting, I just want to talk about tying off at the beginning and end of each row of quilting. So tying off is just how we're going to secure our stitches. And this is really important to remember when we're making these blocks because our seam allowance is only going to be 1/4 inch. So when we start off, we don't want to have any little messy threadness on the back of our backing fabric when we go to join the pieces together. We don't want that to be visible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my stitch length down to 0.4, so that's really small. And I'm going to start stitching a little bit in from the edge of the block, and then I'm going to do 6 or 7 stitches on this very small stitch length. When I get to the end, I'll stop about 1/8 inch away from the edge of the fabric on my top fabric, not talking about the batting and backing, and I'll do the same. So I'm going to finish with my stitch length on 0.4 and then I'm going to do 6 or 7 really small stitches. These really small stitches, when they're sewn close together, they're almost, you can't even unpick them because they're so tiny and they're so close together. So it makes a really nice, neat finish on the edge of your work. But you can finish off any way that you like. You might want to, thread the threads with a hand needle through the quilt. I don't do that, it takes too long, but this is my little method that I like to use. So stitching in the ditch is when you are stitching right in that seam. So to make that easy, you just pull apart away from the seam and then with your fingers and then just ease towards the foot. So go ahead and stitch in the ditch of all the seams on all of your pinwheel blocks. So that's 4 stitching in the ditch rows that you need to do, which is 1, 2, 3, and 4. So 0.4. So now that we have anchored our 3 layers together with the stitching in the ditch, we're going to come back and do some additional quilting lines. So this is what we're going to do here. We're going to stitch some lines. They're about 1/4 inch away from the seam on each of our cream sections. So to do that, you could either just use the edge of your walking foot as a guide, or if you have a guide that comes with your walking foot, I'm actually able to snap that foot off and pop this other foot on, or a sole plate actually I think they call it, I'm not sure, but anyway that gives me this 1/4 inch guide. And I said it doesn't have to be 1/4 inch. If it's the same width as the edge of your walking foot, that's totally fine. So I'm just going to once again start in a little bit from the edge, it's just a fraction, and starting with my small stitches and bringing it back up to a stitch length of 3. And using that as a guide on my seam, I'm going to stitch down. I'm just going to judge so that I stop stitching 1/4 inch away from the next seam. And then I'm just going to spin and then work my way back out. Once again, when I get about 1/8 inch away from the edge of the block, I put my seam or my stitch length down to 0.4 and finish with 6 or 7 stitches. And there's our additional quilting. So we call this kind of stitching echo quilting, and that's when you're stitching an even distance away from the edge of a shape or from a seam. So go ahead and finish all the echo quilting on all of your pinwheel blocks. So now we're going to join the blocks together with a quilt as you go sashing. Basically what I've done is I've just taken the traditional joining strip method and I've just kind of tweaked it a little bit by making the sashing whatever width I like and adding some batting in the middle of it. So say for instance if you wanted a 2-inch sashing or a 3-inch sashing, all you have to do is add your 1/4 inch seam allowance. So 2 inches will become 2.5 inches. So that's for our top strip. You can also do cornerstones with this method. So I have my pieces ready to go. I've made them a little bit longer than my blocks just so that I can stitch it and then trim it as I go. For the sashing, for the top you will need a piece that is 1/2 inch bigger than the width that you want. So I'm going to do 2 inches, so 1/4 inch on either side, that makes it 2.5 inches, so 1/4 inch is my seam allowance. Then for the batting only needs to be 1.5 inches. And for your backing fabric, what I've done is I've made it 2.5 inches plus an extra 1/2 inch. So that's going to bring that up to 3 inches. So that's just going to give me a generous seam allowance. So first of all, this is how we are going to do this. So to get started, I'm going to join my top 2 blocks together. So I'm going to take my back strip and I'm going to put it right sides together with the back of my first block, like that. And I just like to extend an even amount past each end to start with. And now I'm going to take my top piece and I'm going to put it right sides together. And then I'm going to pin all of those layers together in one go. Now I'm going to head to my sewing machine to sew this seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I have my machine threaded up in the same way that I did for quilting, but I have my 1/4 inch foot on because I want a nice neat 1/4 inch seam for this join. And I'm using a stitch length of 3 because I'm sewing through all of those thicknesses. But this time I'm just going to do a regular little reverse stitch at the beginning and end of each row of sewing. Flip both strips out over to the right side and press. Now trim the top and bottom edge of the sashing level with the edge of your block. So here's our top sashing strip, which you can see is bigger than our underneath sashing strip. So I'm going to flip that piece out of the way, and now I'm going to put this piece right sides together with my other pinwheel block, and I'm going to pin that, and then I'm going to head to the machine and sew that with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Make sure that all edges are level. Once again, sew this seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, reversing at the beginning and end of this row. Turn to the right side and press. Flip over to the wrong side and slip in your strip of batting. You can see now that the whole seam is going to have batting. So we have batting in the seam allowance on both sides and our strip of batting. If it's a little bit too big, just give it a trim. At this stage, if you want to, you can hand sew this piece over. And to do that, you've got lots of seam allowance there to play with, and you can just line that up with your stitching line, and you can sew that in place by hand. But if you want to do it by machine, what you would do is mark a line 5/8 of an inch away from the edge of your backing sashing piece. So that's 5/8 of an inch, and now I'm just going to press over on that line. Now when I fold this piece over, this piece is going to cover my stitching line just by about 1/8 of an inch. And now I'm going to use my glue pen just to hold that in place. So I'm just going to run the glue along my seam allowance.
Oh no.
I think I need some new glue. Just like that. I can even give that a little bit of a press, making sure you don't get glue on the iron. And now flip that to the right side. Just pop some pins in the ditch of that seam, just like that. Just to hold our backing piece in place. And when you flip that over, you just want to make sure that you can see where our pins are, and it's about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. If you want to make that a bit neater and adjust it, you can. And now we're going to head to the machine and stitch in the ditch of that seam. So I'm just going to stitch in the ditch using my open toe foot. That way I can see exactly where I'm sewing. I will just do a little tiny reverse stitch at the beginning and end of each row, and pulling that seam apart and stitching in the ditch like that. The trick really is to use a nice flat low loft batting. So this is what it looks like from the front. And this is what it looks like from the back. Using a busy all over backing fabric is a good way to hide any crooked stitching. And now I'm going to do some extra quilting in our sashing to make sure that I'm holding that batting down and keeping that nice and stable in the quilt. So if you were to stitch about 3/8 of an inch away from the edge of this seam here, say using a standard walking foot, that would give you that 3/8 of an inch width. All you would have to do is one row on either side, and that would just keep your batting nice and stable and in position, even when you were washing the quilt. But what I'm going to do is I'm just popping my 1/4 inch foot on. You can use your walking foot for this, and I'm just going to sew 2 rows of stitching that are 1/4 of an inch apart on this side, and then I'll do the same on the other side. So trim the excess of the batting level with the top and bottom of the block. And this is what it looks like from the front, and this is what it looks like from the back. Now go ahead and join your bottom 2 blocks together in the same way. And there you go, there are my bottom 2 pinwheels joined together with the sashing. And now I'm going to join my top pinwheels, my bottom pinwheels together with a horizontal sashing. This time I'm just going to put a little cornerstone in the middle. So these are my pieces. I have a 2.5 inch square for the center and my 2.5 inch wide strips. They're a little bit longer than what is necessary because I will trim them as I go. I have my 1.5 inch strip of batting and a 3 inch wide strip of backing fabric. So first of all, join the center square in between our 2 sashing pieces with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm actually going to press my seams out, even though it's breaking the rule of pressing always towards the darkest colour, but this is going to mean that my sashing seams are going to be going in opposite directions and I'll get more of a nesting happening with my seams. So first of all, place your back strip right sides together with the back. It's a little bit longer than is required, so just centre the strip so you have an even amount on both edges. And now we're going to take our top strip and we're going to place that right sides together. Now the most important thing this time is that we want to make sure when we're pinning that our seams are going to align here. So I'm going to pop my pin through the stitching line about 1/4 inch away from the edge, and then I'm going to go into the seam and then through to the backing piece and bring that back. A little bit tricky pinning all these layers together at once. And the same thing here. Pin through the stitching line, pin through the seam, and then pinning through the backing. Like that. And now I will just continue pinning all those layers together. So the seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Flip both strips to the right side and press. Trim the sashing strips level with both side edges of the blocks. Now place the top section right sides together with the bottom section. Just flick that backing strip out of the way and pin that center sashing onto our other section. Once again, pinning to make sure that our cornerstone seams are going to line up with the seams, the sashing seams on our bottom section. Now something you might find is that this little cornerstone here, there may be a little bit of easing there, and that's because everything has been quilted but this section hasn't been quilted, so you'll be able to just ease that into place as you sew. Now once again, head to the machine and sew that seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Turn to the right side and press the seam. Press from the front, press again from the back, add the strip of batting. Mark the line that is 5/8 of an inch away from the edge of your fabric. Now I know that seems like quite a big seam, but it's just better than having this piece double, and it just gives you a lot of seam allowance to play with. Better to have more than less. Now we're just going to press over on the marked line. Making sure that that is now going to cover our stitching line by about 1/8 of an inch. Run some glue along the seam allowance. Press again. Flip over to the right side. Pin in the ditch. So just before you stitch in the ditch, make sure that your pins are going to be 1/8 of an inch in from that folded edge, just to make sure we're going to catch that. And now away you go, stitch in the ditch. And now for the echo quilting. Looks good. And finish by trimming away the excess batting from the side edges. This is what it looks like from the front, and this is what it looks like from the back. And that's one part of the mystery revealed. So what do you think of that method?
I think it looks pretty good. Maybe a little bit easier than the easy cover strip method. A bit more traditional.
Yeah, more traditional. Nothing's as easy as the easy cover strip method though. And did you see how I sewed one block the wrong way?
Oh well, adds to the charm.
It sure does. But if you're making pinwheels, you've got to make sure that every single block is sewn the same way, and then you won't make the mistake that I made.
I'll see you in the next lesson.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.
Sorry. Okay. All right. So back at the machine, I have threaded up with I can't find my open toe foot. Got it.